well, good morning. We're going to be continuing in through what? Continuing in on Mark chapter 9. We're going to be beginning in verse 30 this morning. Then they left that place and made their way through Galilee, but he did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after he is killed, he will rise 3 days later." But they did not understand the statement, and they were afraid to ask him. They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, because on the way they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest. Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all." He took a child, had him stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one little child such as this in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but him who sent me." So ever since the Transfiguration, Jesus has been on his way to Jerusalem on his final trip. He knows that the time has come for the sacrifice to be made. He knows that the time for his death is approaching, and he's beginning to try to get his disciples to understand this. We've already seen where Peter didn't accept this, and he rebuked Jesus, and so Jesus took him aside and rebuked him. And we've seen that the disciples were really struggling with this concept of the suffering of the Messiah, because even though it's all throughout the Old Testament, and Isaiah has several passages that are known as the suffering servant passages that predict the suffering of the promised one, the reality is the common conception was a military leader was going to arise, take over the throne of David, reestablish Israel as an independent nation state, and free the people to be as they were under David and Solomon. And so that's what they've been expecting, but Jesus is teaching them otherwise. And so after we looked last week at the casting out of the demon and the disciples needing to learn how to live by faith, and how they gotten a little arrogant with the whole authority that Jesus had given them, and they kind of began to think that they were the ones with the authority, and so they didn't really need to pray about things in order to make things happen, and they had to be set straight on that. But now, as they're leaving, they're on their way to Galilee, and Jesus doesn't want anyone to know about it, because largely he wanted to spend this time teaching his disciples. This is the last stretch that he's going to have with them, and there are some things they need to know, and as we see, they're not quite ready for him to leave. They're not ready for his departure. They're not ready to be left in charge of his mission, because they don't even understand the mission. And so he wants to spend time with them, and he wants to help them grasp the mission that he's on. And it goes along this way of he's teaching them, again, saying that the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and after he's killed, he will rise 3 days later. And it says, but they did not understand the statement, and they were afraid to ask him. They did not understand. So what they were not getting was what it really means to follow Jesus, because following Jesus involves following on the hard roads as well. And how do you follow? How do you follow on the hard road? How do you follow Jesus when it's on the way of suffering? What are you supposed to do? And what was it that Jesus was teaching them along the way? Well, the first thing that we need to take notice of is that when we're following Jesus, we need to pursue truth. All right. In other words, don't avoid the truth. When it says they didn't understand the statement and they were afraid to ask him, why were they afraid to ask him? What were they afraid of? Now, some commentators say perhaps they were afraid because they remember that when Peter responded to Jesus originally when Jesus started teaching them about this. It says that Jesus rebuked him. And so perhaps they were afraid that Jesus was going to rebuke them if they asked him about this whole suffering, death, and resurrection thing. But that doesn't really hold up, because Jesus never rebuked them for asking questions. Jesus never rebuked them for seeking clarification. Jesus never rebuked them for wanting to know what he was saying. As a matter of fact, we've seen in his life, he encouraged that kind of questioning. Plus the fact, if you look back, in chapter 8 where Peter got rebuked by Jesus, you find out that Peter didn't ask Jesus a clarifying question. Peter just simply told him, no, you're wrong. It's not going to happen like that. Verse 32 of chapter 8 just says that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And so it wasn't that Peter was rebuked for asking questions. Peter was rebuked because he was rejecting what Jesus was saying. And I don't think, after spending this time with Jesus, I don't think the disciples would be sitting there afraid of asking questions, because they'd never been afraid of asking questions before. And again, Jesus wasn't in the habit of rebuking them for it. So what were they afraid of? And here's what I think. I think they were afraid of him answering. I think they were afraid of exactly what was going on here, because Jesus is now starting to talk like all of their expectations weren't exactly how things were going to go. So their expectation that he was going to establish the throne of David again, that he was going to reestablish Israel. Now he's talking about death. He's going to go, he's going to be betrayed, he's going to be killed, and then rise again. Everybody in the Jewish world, kind of, for the most part, other than the Sadducees and those who followed them, but for the most part, the Jewish understanding was, I know there's a resurrection, but that's at the end of time. So when he's talking about resurrection, they're probably thinking, okay, so he's going to, they're not paying attention to the fact that, he will rise 3 days later. They might be thinking, well, that might be metaphorical. Because, Jesus taught parables. Jesus taught metaphorically a lot, so maybe that's metaphorical. And so perhaps that got them to thinking, now this is conjecture, but perhaps that got them to thinking, well, maybe all of this is metaphorical, right? Yeah. It must be. It's got to be metaphorical. This is a parable of some kind. So we're not going to ask for the meaning of this, because what if it's not? But no, certainly. Well, you know what? We'll just leave it be. We don't understand it, but this is something we don't want to understand. Let's just leave this alone. And it's funny, because they're afraid to ask a clarifying question. And so what do? They just go back to their normal selves and their normal understanding, and then they go back to just going about business as usual, because, I'm just not going to ask. I'm going to leave it alone. There's a couple of movies that come to mind when it comes to this. So John Wayne's Green Berets, and Cary Grant's Operation Petticoat. Both of those movies, Green Berets is, of course, about Army Berets. Green Berets in Vietnam. Operation Petticoat is about a submarine in World War II. In both of those movies, there's a supply officer who knows how to acquire things that are needed for the unit and for the good of the mission. And sometimes the way that they go about that, it might break some regulations. And so in both the movies, John Wayne plays the commander of the Green Beret unit, and Cary Grant plays the commander of the submarine in their respective movies. And in both of those, when their supply officer acquires the things that they need, the commander just kind of looks at them and essentially tells them, I don't want to know how you got this. Because they don't want to know. Plausible deniability, plus fact, it's one of those, sometimes you just don't want to know. And that's where I think the disciples were at, is they really didn't think they wanted to know. But the problem is they needed to know. They needed to understand what was going on. Because what was going on wasn't going to change just because they didn't know about it. And they needed to be prepared for what was coming. And so, really, don't avoid the truth, pursue the truth. They should have been asking the questions. But instead, they go back. They go back to their conception that Jesus is establishing a kingdom, which leads into the next incident here. It's when they get to Capernaum, and he was in the house with them. Now, what house is that? We know that Peter and Andrew had a house in Capernaum. They've been there before, so it's entirely possible that was kind of their home base, so to speak. Doesn't say for sure, but it makes sense to me, and in my mind, that's probably what's going on. But either way, Jesus took them into wherever they were staying, and again, having a private conversation with his disciples, and he goes, okay, so along the way, I noticed you guys were arguing. What were you arguing about? And whereas in verse 32, they were afraid to ask him any questions, here they were silent. They were afraid to answer his questions because they had been arguing about who was the greatest. In other words, who is going to sit closest to Jesus? So when he sets up his kingdom, who's going to have the most prestigious positions? Who's going to be his closest right and left hand people? Who's going to have the most authority in the kingdom that's coming? And they're really arguing about status. Who's going to have the greatest status and the greatest prestige, and who's going to have the greatest honor? Who's going to be honored the most by Jesus when he establishes this kingdom? Because let's forget the suffering thing. We don't understand that. We don't want to understand that because we don't want that to even be a thing. So let's focus in on the important stuff of, okay, which one of us is greatest? Well, then as soon as Jesus asked that, they're a little bit ashamed of themselves, and they should be ashamed of themselves because they know that's not the kind of thing that Jesus would have them arguing about. They've already had discussions about this. They've already had discussions about how, the Gentiles leaders lord it over them, but that's not how you're supposed to be. He's taught them the way of humility. He's taught them the way of service, and here they are arguing about who's going to be the greatest. It's kind of the opposite of humility. And they're not worried about who am I going to serve. They're worried about who's going to serve me. And I think Jesus knew all this, but again, he's drawing out the conversation so that they can have it. And they're like, well, I'm not going to answer the question. Maybe you should answer the question. I don't know. Well, you're the loudest one in the conversation. You answer the question. Well, I'm not going to answer the question. I already said everything I got to say about that, so you answer the question. And nobody's answering. And so what Jesus does is he calls them to him, and understanding what they had been arguing about, he says to them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all. And so if you want to be first, you got to put yourself last. So you pursue truth, but now he's teaching them to avoid arrogance. Don't worry about putting yourself first. Don't worry about jockeying for top place. Don't worry about whether or not you are better than anybody else. That's not the point. As a matter of fact, that's not even the point. If he was going to establish the kingdom the way they thought he was going to, he wasn't going to arrange people in the traditional, typical way. See, in our world, and we still see it today, who is it that gets the furthest ahead? It seems like, especially in government positions, it's whoever's the most arrogant. In other words, whoever speaks the best about themselves, whoever really puts themselves out there as the best individual, whoever it is that makes themselves out to be better than everybody else. And arrogance seems to win the day. And Jesus is like, not my kingdom, it doesn't. You want to be first? Must be last. If you want to make it into first place, you have to put yourself in last place. It's not about jockeying for who's best. It's not about trying to get the most and get more than everybody else. It's not about trying to get above everybody else. As a matter of fact, the second goes right into the third. thing that he's teaching them is you avoid arrogance and you live in service. Whoever wants to be first must be last and be servant of all. And then he called a child to him and took the kid in his arms, and he said to them, whoever welcomes one little child such as this in my name welcomes me. So the idea here is, in the first century world, children were considered less important, second-class citizens. Maybe some look at them as subhuman, not quite human yet. But either way, here they're jockeying for status, position, and he takes a child which would be someone of kind of the lowest status in their society, and said, this one right here, okay? You serve this one. In other words, instead of jockeying for first place, you take the lowest person, the lowest status individual, and you put yourself under them. This is who you're going to serve. Why? Because that's what it's all about. It's not about how many people serve you. It's about how many people you serve. It's not about how much power and authority you have over others to get them to do your bidding. It's all about how you raise others up. It's not about you elevating your own status. It's about you finding people of lower status and elevating them. And how do we do this? Well, you pursue truth and you avoid arrogance. See, there's a lot of people, I think, that would agree on the surface with a lot of this stuff, up and until you get to how it's actually done. In humility and truth. Humility and truth are two things that are very lacking in our society today. All you have to do is check the news out and everything that's going on, even in our own country. There's a lot of people that say that they're trying to elevate those of low status, but they're not. They're not. They're not going about it in humility, and they're not going about it in truth, and they're not accomplishing anything. And honestly, they're not trying to raise anybody up. They're just trying to tear somebody down. And this goes for the ICE stuff that's going on. This goes for other government agencies and people, the way that they're approaching it. This goes for people who are attacking people who aren't in the same political group as them. This goes for people who are attacking people that have different ideas than them, different ideals. There's so much attacking and so much anger and so much, and all it is I'm trying to exert power over somebody else, saying, I've got even more power than you. I will force the right. And Jesus is like that. No, look. That's how the world operates. That's how the world has operated since the beginning. And guess what? After all these centuries, millennia, and however long it's been, it's the same. You do it the world's way, it's not going to accomplish anything. Jesus is saying, no, stop. Humble yourself. Pursue truth. Don't avoid truth. Ask the tough questions. Get the tough answers. Humble yourself. And live in service. You do that. And he says, that will make you great in my kingdom. That's what it's all about. And it's not about forcing your will on others. It's about pursuing God's will. It's not about forcing people to do what you want. It's about you doing for them what they need. It's not about you serving the people you want to serve. It's about you serving whoever needs serving. Because Jesus didn't clarify and say, when I say that you must be a servant, it's to this group only or to that group only. No, he said his words precisely. And verse 35 is, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all. Humble yourself and serve. That's what he wants to see. You see, in his kingdom, which he will establish on earth. I mean, he made that clear before, and the Old Testament even makes it clear. The suffering has to come first, because if he didn't come to take care of the sin problem, which is why he suffered, there wouldn't be anybody to enter into his kingdom, and so it wouldn't matter. So he came so that we could enter into his kingdom, so that we could be a part of his kingdom, so that we could be restored to that position that we were originally created for in the first place. And excuse me. And he will come again, according to the Bible. He is coming again, and he will establish his kingdom here on earth. He said, and these are the people, this is the kingdom I'm building, and these are the types of people that are going to be in it. This is how it's going to operate. And so you want to start living in that kingdom now, before he establishes it? That's good. Why? Because he has ushered in the kingdom. It has begun. The seed has been planted. We can begin living as citizens of that kingdom now. And he's saying, this is how you do it. Did you follow me? Following me doesn't mean that we're going to go down the easy road. We're going to go down the hard road. But how do you survive the hard road? You pursue the truth. You don't avoid it. You avoid arrogance. You humble yourself. And you live in service. He's like, yes, it's difficult, but it doesn't matter how you do this. The road is difficult. This is how you get down the road successfully. This is how you navigate that road and come out victorious. This is how you come in first place in the kingdom. It's about pursuing truth, avoiding arrogance, living in service. It's a tough lesson for the disciples. And it's a lesson they didn't want. They were avoiding it. But Jesus knew they needed to learn this. They had to get this. They had to get this right. Because as soon as he died, rose again, and went back to his Father in heaven, they were the ones that were going to be responsible for continuing to prepare the world for the coming kingdom. And so they had to understand this. They had to get this right. So they could try to avoid it all they want. Fact is, the truth was going to find them out. So Jesus teaches them. This is the way. It is a hard way, yes. And that's why the world avoids it. It's hard. It's difficult. What's really humorous, though, is, if everybody on earth did this, how much easier life would be for everyone. Why? Because this is the way it's designed to be. Our sin has convinced us that we don't need to live this way. But the truth is, any other way of living doesn't produce the end result that we're looking for. So you want to come in first, Jesus says? Then don't worry about coming in first. Put that to the side. Seems counterintuitive, but it works. And so his call to his disciples is to lay down the world's way of doing this. Stop avoiding the truth. Pursue it. Intentionally pursue truth. Humble yourself. And live in service. And you will find that that's the way to come in first place. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you today. We do thank you for the opportunity to be together to worship you and learn from your word. We do pray, Lord, that you would help us as we seek to follow you, to learn how to follow you in this way. Help us not to avoid the truth, but help us to pursue the truth. Help us to truly seek to understand your ways and to live them. Help us not to be arrogant people, but help us to be humble. And help us to serve. Help us to live lives of service to everyone around us. Help us to be marked by this service to others. And teach us what that kind of service looks like. Teach us to be like you. Help us to live like you, love like you, and serve like you. So that we can live the life that you've intended us to live, and so that we can prepare ourselves and others to be ready when you usher your kingdom into this world and you bring in its fullness. We thank you for the promise that indeed Jesus is returning again to establish that kingdom. And I pray, Lord, that we would be ready when that happens. I thank you and I praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.